Hi students, in this video I'm going to talk a bit about virtue ethics. So let's begin. Alright, so if you're watching this video, you've probably watched some other videos or you're familiar with some of the other theories that we've been learning about. We probably talked about consequentialist views already and deontological views, and so in this video we're going to focus on virtue ethical views, which are a kind of theory of character. What does it mean for a theory to be a theory of character? So here I'm going to draw a distinction between two kinds of theories, theories of right action and theories of character. So theories of right action, like act utilitarianism, Kantian ethics, Ross's ethic of prima facie duties, all those theories start with an account of right action, what it means to perform the right acts, and then they use that view in order to inform their accounts of good character. So by good character we mean like a good person. So the good person, or someone who has good character, if they're the kind of person who performs right actions. For utilitarianism, right, the good person or someone has good character when they maximize utility, they perform actions that maximize utility. Theories of character are a little bit different in that they sort of develop their view of right action off of their view of good character. So they, like virtue ethics and care ethics, start with an account of what it means to be a good person, and then use that to inform their account of right action. So if we want to figure out what the right action to perform is, we need to start by thinking about what does it mean to be a good person, and then think about something like, well, what would that kind of person do? And that tells us what the right action is. All right, so if we look at some theories of right action, we've talked about act utilitarianism. That evaluates actions from the third person perspective. We look at the action's consequences. We're asking ourselves something like, from a zoomed out view, what's best for the world, or what's best for everyone? And there we're just sort of looking, like I said, at the consequences of the action. For Kantian ethics, we're evaluating actions from the second person perspective. We're thinking something like, is this respectful? Is this fair? We're looking at the agent's intentions or their maxims. We're looking at, are they interacting well kind of with the people around them? That second person perspective, like the you. So am I treating you appropriately? And then with theories of character, specifically virtue ethics, we're evaluating actions from this first person perspective. So really the question is, what does it mean for me to be a good person? And which actions are right really depend on which actions someone would perform if that person is flourishing or if that person is doing well. So here we're looking at the agent's character traits. Do they have good character traits or bad ones? We might also be looking at their motives or values, like what's underlying the actions that they're doing, rather than looking at the actions themselves. As I have this slide up here, I was thinking about care ethics, and care ethics might actually be, it's a theory of character, but it might actually be more like Kantian ethics in that it's sort of thinking about things more from a second personal point of view, but we'll talk about that later. All right, so there are a couple different versions of virtue ethics. I'm going to talk about two in this video, but there are some others. The question is really just, what do you emphasize? How do you think about what it means to be a good person? And what implications does that have for which actions are the right ones? So target-centered virtue ethics, I'm going to give a definition here. It's the view that an action is morally permissible if and only if it's consistent with the virtues. You might say, well, what does that mean? Well, here we need an account of like what the virtues are. So to give a little bit more detail, we're going to say an action is consistent with the virtues if and only if someone who has all the virtues could perform it. Again, you might say, well, I'm still not sure what the virtues are. And for Plato, there were sort of four cardinal virtues. By cardinal, kind of like the cardinal directions, thought these were like the main virtues, and we could understand the other virtues relative to these four. So here in this picture we see wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Those are the 4 cardinal virtues. Now, you might have seen an image like this one before in a previous video or in class. For Plato, he thought that our minds or our souls were made up of these different parts, and that it was important that the rational part, that person on the right side there, was ruling, that they were in charge of the other parts, the appetitive part and the spirited part. But he also thought that there was sort of a virtue associated with each part. So on the one hand, there are appetites, our desires, the things that we're attracted to that give us pleasure. And he thought, with respect to this part of our soul or mind, the virtue is temperance. We shouldn't be sucked in to pursuing pleasure too much that it causes problems for us elsewhere. So we need temperance to avoid becoming addicted to those pleasurable things. With respect to the spirited part, he thought that the virtue was courage. So in particular, he's sort of thinking about battle context or something like this. The scaredy cat, right, lacks courage and they run away from dangerous situations. And he thinks that's really no sort of way to live a good life. But on the other hand, we shouldn't be rash or sort of seek out danger for no good reason. So here the virtue of the spirited part and the emotions is courage. Then for the human or the rational part, he thought that the virtue was wisdom. So are we developing a kind of practical understanding of what we should and shouldn't do in various situations? Now, you might be thinking, hey, there's one other virtue that you haven't mentioned, and that's justice. And for Plato, he sort of thought that justice is kind of a virtue that's not specific to one of the parts, but rather it's the virtue that you get when the parts are in harmony with each other, or when the rational part is ruling the other parts. So the person who's just is the person whose rational part rules. That's going to give you the kind of fairness virtue that is justice is. All right, so that's a little bit of background. Plato comes before Aristotle, so that's sort of how Plato was thinking about it, but Aristotle develops Plato's views in certain ways. So we're still talking about target-centered virtue ethics, but we're going to talk about some contributions that Aristotle made to this theory. So Aristotle develops a more sophisticated view of what it means for something to be a virtue. And on his view, virtuous agents act from virtues, and these are excellent character traits. It's tempting to describe a character trait simply as a habit, but character traits are deeper than habits. They're not merely a habit. So consider something like honesty. He thinks like the virtue of honesty is not just a habit to perform honest actions, but rather that character traits are dispositions to notice, believe, feel, desire, choose, and act in certain characteristic ways. So the honest person not only acts honestly, but they notice opportunities for honesty, or they notice dishonesty. They believe, right, that honesty is valuable. They develop certain feelings, probably. They feel guilty when they are dishonest, or they the dishonesty of others turns them off. Again, desires, they desire trait-related goods. They choose and act in the trait-related ways. Here's something I'm just sort of adding in, right? I'd say that character traits develop around our values, or the things that we care about. So one example to kind of illustrate this in my own life is that is sort of a change I made at one point where I started changing my eating habits. So I had dated a girl who was vegan, and I was living in Boulder, Colorado, and a lot of my classmates were vegan or vegetarian. And I started thinking to myself, like, I sort of sympathize with their view. I think it's probably problematic to eat animals, especially factory farmed animals. And so I started becoming a vegetarian. And early on, that was kind of hard, or I made mistakes. So like I ate my ravioli or lasagna, I guess it was, from my mom, not really thinking or realizing that there was meat in lasagna, which to me now I'm like, well, obviously, but in the moment it just didn't occur to me. And so this is sort of like an example, I think, of when you develop a certain value, like caring for animals, you might not be perfect at first about noticing or paying attention to um, where that virtue is relevant or where that thing shows up. But as you care about the thing, you start to pay more attention. So, um, my wife and I at our wedding, we were trying to have it be vegetarian, but then we had like hot chocolate and there were marshmallows in it, and marshmallows have gelatin in them. And so again, it's like I didn't notice that or I didn't think about that at the moment. But over time, I've become more sensitive to those things. I start to pay attention or see the ways that we use animals and in our everyday life. And the things that people say, the things that they do, sort of the way I think about them has definitely changed significantly as a result. So that's the goal here, is to sort of paint you a picture, not to say you should become a vegetarian or something like that, but rather to paint you a picture of how caring about something or valuing something can change not just the way you act, but the things you notice, the things you desire, uh, the things you feel. All right, so Aristotle also becomes famous for this doctrine of the golden mean. What's that? According to Aristotle, every virtue lies between two vices. That's what the doctrine of the golden mean says. So let's look at the cardinal virtues that we talked about already. Courage. This is maybe the most obvious example. So courage lies between the vice of cowardice and rashness, or some people call it foolhardiness. But the idea here is like the courageous person um, has the right relationship to fear. The cowardly person has too much fear. The rash person has too little fear. Think of like Evel Knievel or something like that. People who do dangerous things for no good reason necessarily. Um, it's important for Aristotle and virtue ethicists that we avoid both extremes and that we hit the mean between them. Temperance. So temperance lies between a kind of insensibility, someone who doesn't appreciate pleasurable things, and the person who overindulges, is self-indulgent, or we might say intemperate. So, um, like back when I was younger, I thought, it's always wrong to drink alcohol, and that's absolutely a bad thing. But over time, I've come to think, no, that's not really the right sense, the right way to think about it. But it's also not good to overindulge in alcohol. So finding like sort of a middle ground there is the virtuous thing to do. With respect to wisdom, maybe one way to think about it here is that there's the fool who has like no wisdom, we might think, and then there's the person who's bookish or whose interest in knowledge is aimed at the wrong sorts of things or impractical things. I say here, maybe it doesn't lie between two vices. Of course, Aristotle would not agree with that, but um, the thought is that there's maybe no obvious, like, too much wisdom, but rather wisdom directed at the wrong targets, or the goal of knowledge directed at the wrong sorts of things. Finally, there's justice, and justice, see, if we thought about it a bit, we'd see that there are a lot of ways to be unjust, right? It might be sexist or racist or speciesist, something like that. But one way that Aristotle talks about it is there's justice with respect to money, and that lies between meanness or stinginess, right? We know people who are stingy or aren't willing to share their wealth. Maybe you think of somebody who tips really poorly. And then someone who's prodigal or vulgar. There's this famous story in the Christian Bible about the prodigal son who gets his father's inheritance and then goes and spends all the money on getting pleasure, basically, and then runs out. And so Aristotle's sort of thinking, no, it's important that we not be stingy, but it's also important that we not give all our money away too quickly. This little chart is kind of a more detailed version of some of Aristotle's views, you'll see that he has, for each virtue, the thought is that there's some object, and then there's a deficiency and excess. So I like the one, you can read through this on your own, but I like the one sort of at the bottom with respect to anger, right? There's some people who are good-tempered, right? They have the appropriate amount of anger, but then we know there are some people who get angry too easily or have too much anger. That's the irascible person in Aristotle's view. And then there's the unirascible person, the person you sort of can't get to be angry no matter what you do. And Aristotle thinks, there's a virtue in between there, and that's what we want to develop. You also might think, well, there's something sort of funny going on. He has like different virtues for people who desire small honors and people who desire large honors, and giving small sums versus giving large sums. And so clearly, like, Aristotle was being thoughtful, maybe getting down into the details a bit a bit too much here, but it's interesting, right, to see how he's developing or working out his view. Before moving on, I wanted to also share some other virtues that are out there. So I think of Christianity has its own set of theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. It identifies as virtues. Feminism has the virtue of care, and that's a view we'll talk about later. And then there are just a bunch of other ones as well. Feminism has more than just care, but that's the main one. I've listed that here. But I've sort of developed, I have a handout that I'll share with you, or I can share with you, that lists a bunch of different virtues, but I sort of think of them as fitting into roughly 6 categories rather than the mere 4 that the virtue ethicists originally had. And you'll see that I do have the main 4, but then I also think there may be sort of like utilitarian kinds of virtues. Those are related to benevolence, so friendliness, generosity, kindness. We might think those are sort of related to justice in certain ways, but we might also think there's a way in which, like, consequentialism or the utilitarian insights are not fully appreciated by the virtue ethicists. And then there's some care-related virtues. So here's a sense in which maybe the virtue ethicists have kind of like a masculine view of morality, and if we appreciated the feminist elements of morality, then we would appreciate other virtues like conscientiousness, empathy, love, mercy, those sorts of things. The ones that are in purple that I've highlighted are intellectual virtues that I thought we should be thinking about or paying attention to in the course. So intellectual courage, intellectual empathy, intellectual curiosity, intellectual humility. We might have, like, again, these are virtues, like moral virtues, but we might think of them as intellectual virtues too. Like, intellectual courage involves investigating questions that are maybe controversial or something like that, or again, sort of speaking up to challenge a view of somebody else. I won't describe them all, but you can think about the intellectual element of those virtues. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about exemplarist virtue ethics. This is kind of a different approach to virtue ethics. The focus here is not on thinking about, like, what character traits do the virtuous people have, and then deriving what the right actions are from that, but rather focusing on, like, who's a good person, and then thinking about, like, what would that particular person do. So if I had to give a definition for this theory, I would put put this one. An action is morally permissible if and only if a virtuous person would perform it in the relevant circumstances. I like to think of this as like the WWJD view. So back when I was a middle schooler, or maybe even a little younger than that, elementary school, there WWJD bracelets were extremely popular, and the thought with the bracelet was you need to think about, when you're acting, you need to think about what Jesus would do. So WWJD stands for what would Jesus do? And the idea was, like, when you're ever in a tough spot, just look at your wrist and think about what Jesus would do. And if he would do it, then, it's okay to do that thing. But if he wouldn't do it, then you shouldn't do that thing. And that's kind of the motivating idea behind exemplarist virtue ethics. How do we apply this theory? Well, the first step is to identify the virtuous people who you can imagine being in the situation that you're in. So we talked about Jesus as being one, but you might pause the video at this point and think about who are some moral exemplars that I have in mind, that you have in mind, right? Maybe Jesus isn't the person for you, but you think there are other people who you admire for their ethics. Or another way to sort of think about this, again, it's a first-person view, so it thinks being moral should be good for you in some sense. So if we think about people who are living like the best kind of life, or the life that we admire and we want to live for ourselves, that can be another way to think about it. So again, you could pause your video here if you want. Try and think about who some moral exemplars are. I've come up with some. Jesus, Harriet Tubman, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, and Mr. Rogers, a more contemporary example maybe. So my thinking here, I think maybe a lot of these people are sort of exemplars in the sense that they did radical things that seem out of the ordinary. So maybe there's a sense in which the examples I've chosen err on the kind of moral extremist or moral exemplar side, but we could come up with other examples of people who are just admirable, people we look up to and we want to live kind of lives like theirs. Maybe Mr. Rogers fits a little bit better in that mold. He was sort of radical in certain ways, but in more subtle ways. So his life seems like the good kind of life, a life that we might want to live for ourselves. Okay, now once we have the sort of people who we can imagine in the situation, we want to identify how we think they would act in the circumstances. And I say here, if you can ask them, you should. So I have a friend like Dan Lowe, and when I'm teaching and I come across a difficult teaching question, I think about, how should I be as a teacher? I think to myself, what would Dan Lowe do? But sometimes, maybe I'm teaching a new class, I might call up Dan Lowe and say, hey, how would you teach this class? In fact, I did that a couple years ago with the class I was teaching. I thought, you've taught this class before. Tell me about it. What do you think I should do here? So sometimes it won't be that important to ask the exemplar, but if there are opportunities to do that, you can. Now, one problem with this theory is called the contradiction problem. And the contradiction problem is this. So what if different virtuous people would do different things in the relevant situation? For example, you might have a kind of injustice going on, and Harriet Tubman is going to just go ahead and break the law. Gandhi is going to stage a hunger strike. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to organize some sort of nonviolent protest. Those are all different ways we might respond to an injustice. And there might be occasions in which it's just not clear which of those is the right one to do, or are all of them okay? It's a little unclear. So when we face injustice, we might say, well, what should I do? And Schaefer-Lin Dow has a solution to this problem. His thought is this: if no virtuous people would do the thing, then that action is wrong. So you definitely can't do it. But if some virtuous people would do the thing, then it's permissible to do it. And if all virtuous people would do the thing, then it's obligatory to do. So one example I like to think about here is maybe donating to charity. Of course, whether or not someone can do that depends on their circumstances and how much wealth or money they have. And we might say, well, let's assume that we're relatively well off. We've got the money to donate, potentially. Not all virtuous agents would necessarily donate to the same place, but maybe all virtuous agents would donate some of their money to charity. So in this case, maybe donating to charity is obligatory in the sense that all virtuous agents in the situation would do it. But which particular charity you choose, that's more flexible, and it's permissible to donate to a number of different ones. All right, the final thing I want to talk about before we sort of turn to applying the theory is the way in which virtue ethicists think about moral development. So one way of thinking is well, people are virtuous or they're vicious, and there's really no room for anything in between. But that is obviously not right. If you look around, a lot of people are just sort of ordinary. They're not really virtuous per se, but they're not vicious either. So the virtue ethicists thought there was like these intermediate categories, the continent person and the incontinent person. So we're going to start with the vicious person, kind of work our way up and better understand the nature of moral development. Okay, so the vicious person, they have three sort of features that are true about them. A, they don't know what the right thing to do is, or they're confused about it. They think the right thing is actually the wrong thing. They act wrongly, and they enjoy doing the wrong thing. So here we might imagine someone like the Joker in the Batman movies. The Joker, not only does he act wrongly, but he seems to enjoy it, and he has no sense that like what he's doing is wrong. He sort of thinks it's right. So he likes causing chaos. Now that is a real vicious person. Like that, you're in a bad shape if you're the Joker. But it's more likely that we aren't there. We're most likely in the incontinent or the continent stages. So the incontinent person, I've bolded the ones that sort of distinguish them maybe from the ones below. So the incontinent person, different than the vicious person, that they know what to do. They know what the right thing is, but they can't do it. They sort of can't get themselves to act rightly. But they don't enjoy it. So the thought here is like, they might know that they should call their parents more often, but they can't get themselves to do it. But they feel guilty about it, at least, So some of us are here, and with each particular like kind of virtue or kind of action in our life, we could be at different stages. We're not incontinent in everything if we're incontinent in one thing. So that's an example. If I think about go back to me, when I was thinking about giving up eating meat, there was a time in my life where I thought, yeah, it's probably wrong to eat meat, or especially factory farm meat, but I do it anyway, but I feel bad about it. Sorry if you hear some tinging in the background. I think that's my daughter has lost her phone. Okay, so that's incontinent. The continent person, they're different. They know what to do, just like the incontinent person, but they actually do it. However, they don't really enjoy it. So we could imagine, again, someone who calls their parents. They know what to do. They know that they should, and they do it, but they don't really like it. It's still uncomfortable for them. Finally, the virtuous person, they know what to do, they do it, and they enjoy doing it as well. So that enjoyment of doing the right thing, that's a distinguishing feature of the virtuous person. All right, so now we're going to figure out how to apply this theory. You'll notice that I've talked about two different versions of virtue ethics, the target-centered and the exemplarist. We're going to sort of just focus on the target-centered version. So we're going to apply this definition. An action is morally permissible if and only if it's consistent with the virtues. So as we apply the theory, we want to ask the following questions. First, what virtues does the action seem to demonstrate, and why does it seem to demonstrate them? Number two, what virtues does the action seem to be inconsistent with, and why does it seem to be inconsistent with them? So here you're listing virtues, then you're giving some brief explanation. And then finally, what do you think virtuous people would do in the relevant circumstances? Would they all do the action in question? Would some of them do it, but others wouldn't? Would none of them do it? Again, here, if you can give a little bit of explanation why, that would be good. It might be good also to point to an exemplar, like, oh, I imagine this person would do it. If you think someone else wouldn't, you could point out who that is. So we'll go ahead and look at some examples and try to show you or demonstrate how this works. So here's an example of a student, Imani, a first-year college student who wants to meet new people or maybe to start dating someone new. So she downloads some dating apps over the weekend and starts swiping. A week or so later, she decides that online dating isn't a good fit for her. Some of the people are being rude to her. She doesn't really seem to have time. It's just not something she wants to do right now. So she talks about it with her best friend, Jake, and she tells him she wants a clean break, but she's conflicted. It would feel like a relief to go in and just delete all her profiles in a few clicks, then be done with it. She doesn't want a relationship with any of the guys that she's been talking to so far. However, she's wondering whether it would be okay to just delete her profile without replying to the people that she's been communicating with. So the thought here is that she's been talking with some people, but given she's feeling a bit overwhelmed, is it okay for her to just like ghost them, right? So that's the sort of moral question we're asking: is ghosting morally permissible? And for the virtue ethicist, we just need to ask, well, is ghosting consistent with the virtues? So you might think, well, what are some virtues that it's consistent with? What are some virtues that it's not consistent with? Think about those questions. So here's my take. Probably not, or at least in general, ghosting is not okay. There might be cases in which it's wise. We'll get back to that in a second. But generally, ghosting seems unjust because it fails to give others what they're owed. Like when you're communicating with somebody, you owe them like sort of wrapping up the conversation. If you're talking in person and you just walk away from someone in the middle of the conversation, that would be quite rude. So it seems like there's something unjust about it. If you're just afraid of like, maybe if you're legitimately afraid of them being rude or mean, then maybe it's not cowardly, but it could be cowardly if you're just like, well, I don't want that person to be mad at me. Well, it's okay if people are mad at you. That sometimes is fine. Or it's lazy, right? If you're like, well, this would take a lot of time, and I'd rather just watch TV or something like that. That would be a bad reason. However, I say here, like whether a virtuous person would ghost guys they've been conversing with might depend on the circumstances, and that might be true for a lot of cases in virtue ethics. If a guy made demeaning or inappropriate jokes, a virtuous person might ghost that person, but I don't think they would ghost other guys who had been more considerate in the conversation. Of course, yeah, all this depends on the specific details, and if you highlight or emphasize certain details of the case, you might be able to come up with slightly different verdicts. Here's another case we've talked about before, the case of the dying millionaire. So, is breaking your promise to the dying millionaire consistent with the virtues? Here, I think it's hard to say. Honesty and fidelity might speak in favor of keeping the promise, but other virtues like benevolence and care speak against it. Why is this? Well, honesty, right, keeping your promises, fidelity, promise keeping, those speak in favor of keeping the promise. Benevolence, doing the thing that's the best or has the greatest benefits, caring for the sick or the needy, those point in the other direction. Again, here, I think that whether a virtuous person would break their promise probably depends on the circumstances. In this case, I'm probably inclined to think the virtuous person might privilege the needs of the dying children over the needs of the cavaliers, but I don't know that I'm insistent on that. I think somebody could virtuously give the money to Dan, probably. But again, we might ask ourselves questions like, how insistent was the dying millionaire that you donate to Dan Gilbert? Would they have been okay with you donating to the Red Cross? Do you have any sense of that? So yeah, I suspect some virtuous people would break the promise, other people might not. Some other examples, the famous trolley problem. Is flipping the switch consistent with the virtues? Maybe I'm giving away some of my biases here or something, but I think probably flipping the switch is benevolent. It doesn't seem foolish, right? It doesn't seem in conflict with wisdom. It doesn't seem cowardly. It doesn't seem inconsistent with justice. It doesn't seem intemperate. If there's a vice in the vicinity here, maybe it's like rashness or something like that. But assuming that there's no reason to think this is some sort of elaborate setup, then I don't think it's rash to flip the switch. Assuming that, then I think virtuous people would flip the switch. And I think that's kind of just evidenced by how many people, when they're presented with this situation, think like that's the right thing to do. But we have this other case, and this case sort of poses potential problems because it looks like in many ways it's the same setup, but people's intuitions change. And I think that virtue ethics can kind of explain why there's a change here. So I think that pushing the large man probably isn't consistent with the virtues. It's unjust in virtue of the fact that it's disrespectful. It's using them as a means. It's pushing them without their consent. Those sorts of Kantian considerations, right, seem kind of relevant. It manifests a kind of hubris or pride insofar as it suggests that you think your views about what's best should take precedence over other people's views about what's best. So those are how some virtues might be relevant here. But I also think, I just try and imagine a virtuous person pushing this person over the ledge, and I just can't. I have a really hard time imagining that. Even though that would maximize happiness, the virtuous person isn't the kind of person who can just willy-nilly push people off of ledges. They've developed habits and character traits that are stable enough that they can't sort of on a moment's notice think, oh, well, in this case it calls for pushing this guy off the bridge. I just don't think that's how people are psychologically. So this is maybe an interesting feature of virtue ethics, is that it's committed to certain claims about human psychology in a way that the other theories ignore. So maybe it's just impossible to be a perfect utilitarian because psychologically we can't do the calculations all the time, or we can't change back and forth so quickly. And in that sense, these theories of character that focus on well, what's a good person, and then derive right actions from that, there might be something superior about them here. I think this is the last example I want to talk about. Playing violent video games. So is playing violent video games consistent with the virtues? This is the kind of action that I think both the utilitarians and the Kantians are going to say, this is perfectly fine. So what are the consequences of playing violent video games? Well, nobody's really hurt. It's fun. It supports an industry, the video game industry. There's some good stuff going on here. It's hard to really criticize the playing of violent video games. Same with the Kantian. Are we treating anyone disrespectfully? No, they're characters in a game. It's true that we're killing them, but they don't have autonomy, so we don't owe them respect or anything like that. So it's perfectly fine. But virtue ethics, I think is going to say, no, this isn't consistent with the virtues. So if we think about what we're doing when we're playing violent video games, we're taking pleasure in the wrong sorts of things, namely the simulated suffering and death of innocent people. We're getting a pleasure bump from that. And that seems like it's intemperate. Temperance is about getting pleasure in the right amounts, but also from the right sorts of things. And this seems like it's taking pleasure in the wrong sorts of things. Plus, if we think about would Jesus play violent video games? Could I imagine Jesus playing Grand Theft Auto? And I just cannot imagine that as something that he would do, or any of the other sort of virtuous people that we had on our list. Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa. These are just not the sorts of people who are going to be playing these violent video games. You might also wonder, are they really going to be playing video games at all? And maybe infrequently, but they're certainly not the kinds of people who become addicted to those games. All right, just to wrap up, I've put here the definition for virtue ethics. An act is morally permissible if and only if it's consistent with the virtues. That's the definition of the theory as we're going to apply it. And then as you apply it, you're thinking about what virtues does the action demonstrate, and you're explaining why it does seem to demonstrate those. You're identifying virtues that the action seems to be inconsistent with, explaining why there's an inconsistency there. And I think you're doing some sort of, in a way, there you're starting to do some big picture thinking, it's not merely the number. So if it's consistent with more virtues than it's inconsistent with, that doesn't really tell us anything. The question is, could the virtuous person, the person with all the virtues, do this action. And so if there's some virtue that it's just definitely inconsistent with, there's no way some virtuous person would do it, then that action is going to be wrong. So so I think to like help get you at that, I have this last question, right? What do you think virtuous people would do in this circumstance? Would they all do it? Would some of them do it? Would none of them? Explain your answer there. All right, hopefully this was helpful, and have a good day.